Before we get started with this episode, I want to give a special thanks to author Les Kruger. Almost all the information you're going to hear today comes from his book, Brothers in Blood, the true story of Ed and Alonzo Maxwell. If you get a chance, buy a copy. It is really a great read, very compelling. His book covers so many more details about the Maxwell brothers and the events that led to the lynching than I could ever tell in this short video. So let's get to it. Today we're going to look at a tragic and sad story that happened over 100 years ago. It happened in the late 1800s, and it culminated with the hanging of a man named Ed Maxwell in one of the last lynchings in Wisconsin's history. Why was he lynched? Find out in the next episode of I Did Not Know That. Today's episode, the Durand lynching, a small town pushed to the limit. I think many people have a mindset that cowboys and gunslingers existed only in places like Dodge City in Kansas or Tombstone, Arizona. But the legendary city of Deadwood is actually in South Dakota, where you'd find characters like Wyatt Earp, Calamity Jane, and Wild Bill Hickok. Then, of course, there's Northfield, Minnesota. On September 7th, 1876, when the famous James Gang, led by Jesse James, tried to rob the First National Bank of Northfield in Minnesota, it turned out to be their last robbery. Despite a knife to his throat, the bank clerk refused to open the vault for them. When the citizens learned the bank was being robbed, they didn't take too kindly to the idea and headed to the bank with their guns. They engaged the James Gang in a violent gunfight, and two of the gang were killed right there. Jesse James and what was left of his group escaped. A posse soon killed another gang member and then captured the three younger brothers. Only Frank and Jesse James escaped, and that was the end of the James Gang. The lynching of Ed Maxwell takes place only a few years later, and 70 miles east of Northfield, just across the Minnesota border into the town of Durand, Wisconsin. But that's where this episode and Ed Maxwell's life will end. So let's go back to Illinois, where Ed Maxwell was born and raised, and find out a bit about him. Ed was the eldest of 7 kids. He was born in 1853, and he developed a close relationship with his brother Alonzo, also called Lon. Alonzo was known to idolize his older brother. The boys came from a good home, but were known to be somewhat mischievous children. Ed was 4 years older than brother Alonzo, and by the time Ed was in his late teens, he graduated from mischief to theft when he was suspected of stealing 2 coats from a store. Later, when Ed saw the owner and the deputy approaching him, he stole the store owner's horse, waved his pistol in the air in a threatening manner, and took off into the woods. This episode is significant because Ed would repeat this type of behavior whenever he was caught or cornered in the future. He would shout out threats and then disappear into the brush. Ed was eventually caught, convicted of stealing the clothes, the horse, and evading capture. He was sent to Joliet Penitentiary in 1874. 1 year later, he was released, and he went to Nebraska, where his parents had moved. Ed was in Nebraska looking for his brother Lon. It's speculated that while Ed was in prison, he might have decided that a life of crime was the life for him, and he needed a partner. Well, he eventually found Lon, and the two went on a crime spree back in Illinois, usually breaking into farmhouses while families slept. They stole money, horses, carriages, and were always heavily armed. They'd commit a robbery, ride the horses hard for 70 miles or so, and then let them go. They were also excellent shots. Their crime spree ended when they were apprehended in Beardstown, Illinois, and brought to Blandonsville, Illinois for trial. The boys briefly escaped, but were captured again. The townspeople were still fuming over the crime spree the brothers had committed in their previously peaceful town, and there was some talk of stringing them up, but fortunately nothing came from it. By now, the two were becoming fairly well known. The media interviewed the boys and seemed to find them charming and hardly dangerous criminals. Both men were small, wiry, and very young looking. One newsman even wondered if all they needed was a good spanking. 3 weeks later, they made a jailbreak, and while Lon didn't make it far, Ed broke free and, of course, headed for some woods and then stole a horse. Lon was sentenced to 2 years in Joliet. Ed was finally spotted about a year later in Stillwater, Minnesota, arrested and sentenced to 6 years in Joliet prison. Alonzo was released in 1877 and Ed in 1881. No one knows why, but Alonzo started a new life in a lumber town called Hersey, Wisconsin when he was released from prison. As you can see in these maps, it was not far from the Minnesota border. He changed his name to Lawrence Williams, which was probably an attempt to move on from his past life of crime. He soon fell in love with a beautiful but young girl named Fanny Hussey. He was 22 and she was only 16, but they married in 1880. Lon made a vow to give up his life of crime, and at one point stated, "When I got married and settled down, I intended to lead an honorable and upright life." Unfortunately, while chopping wood that winter, he cut his foot badly. It got infected and a toe had to be amputated. Fanny was now pregnant, and Alonzo couldn't work until his foot was healed. Money started to become very tight. We all face critical choices at times, sometimes decisions that turn out to be pivotal moments in our lives. Ed Maxwell was released from prison at this time and moved in with the young couple in early 1881. Alonzo's decision to let Ed back into his life was one that would set in motion events that forever changed all of their lives. In just a matter of months, only one of that household of 3 would be left alive. Ed took on the name of Williams instead of Maxwell, and the two brothers quickly returned to their lives of stealing horses and burglaries in western Wisconsin and Minnesota. Authorities eventually began to realize that the Williams brothers were in fact the notorious Maxwell brothers, and they were up to no good again. While the brothers were out stealing and creating havoc, Alonzo decided it would be best to move his wife Fanny in with her parents. It wasn't long before a man named Miletus Knight showed up at her door. Knight was an undersheriff, an assistant to the sheriff, and he was with Marshal William Seeley. He had recovered a stolen horse and buggy, which he believed was stolen by Lon and Ed. Knight began interrogating the pregnant Fanny, who was now 17. As you can imagine, this was all terribly upsetting to this naive young girl. She had no idea she'd married a man with such a criminal past. As Knight pressed her for more information, they also began searching her parents' home. The stress and the shame was more than she could bear. Shortly after this, she went into labor, and the baby was stillborn. Tragically, she died soon afterward. She was buried in the local cemetery, and her tombstone reads, Hussey, beloved wife of Alonzo Maxwell, age 17 years, 2 months, and 26 days. Word got back to Lon only after the funeral that Fanny and their child were both dead. He was livid and took little to no responsibility for the role he played in the tragedy. He and Ed vowed to kill Miletus Knight and to never be taken alive. On July 10, 1881, Sheriffs Milton and Charles Coleman heard that the Williams brothers were headed toward the home of Miletus Knight with deadly intent. Milton Coleman was a sheriff in Menominee, and his brother Charles a sheriff in Durand. Milton had been in town transporting a prisoner and had stopped off to visit his brother Charles when they got the news. They decided to head off the so-called Williams brothers before they got to Knight's home. The Coleman brothers soon saw Ed and Lon coming up the street. Milt lifted his gun and said, "You are my..." Before Milt could say prisoner, the bullet from Lon's gun tore into his neck. It ripped through his jugular, and he was probably killed instantly. Ed Maxwell and Charles Coleman fired at each other, and one of Ed's bullets hit Charles in the chest and another in the right arm and shoulder. He died soon after. Now, the Coleman brothers were each able to get off shots and even hit the Maxwell brothers before they died. But the Colemans had made a fatal mistake prior to the showdown. Their shotguns were loaded only with birdshot, and that is why the Maxwells were able to walk away only wounded. The cold-blooded murder of these two officers began one of the biggest manhunts in United States history. It wasn't until September that the brothers were spotted again, this time posing as hunters in Pearl, Illinois. On September 25th, a group of officers came across the Maxwells in the woods. In that gunfight, several officers were wounded, and sadly, Sheriff John Lammy was shot in the head. The Maxwells then stole 3 of the officers' horses and shot a 4th horse so that they couldn't be followed. As you can imagine, the anger and outrage over the murderous actions of the Maxwells was growing. Their ability to escape and disappear after committing horrific murders was leading to a sense of frustration. Finally, on November 5th, 1881, Sheriff Joseph Killian of Hall County, Nebraska, received a report that 2 suspicious strangers who fit the Maxwell's description were seen at a farm near Grand Island. Killian organized a posse of 3 men and arrived at the farm at the crack of dawn, posing as hunters looking for breakfast. Killian noticed that Lon had hid his feet under the bedding when he changed his socks. Killian knew about Lon's missing toe, and he felt he was trying to hide it. When Alonzo stepped outside, Killian and the other officers grabbed Ed, and after a brief fight, subdued him. Ed alerted Lon with a loud war cry. Alonzo tried to rescue Ed and actually fired a shot into the building. He made an attempt to gain entrance into the house to save his brother, but he soon realized he was outnumbered. He ran into the tall grass and disappeared. After Ed's arrest, he denied being Ed Maxwell. When they attempted to photograph him in order to send his photo to Joliet Prison for verification, Ed refused to cooperate. He purposely squirmed and distorted his face in an attempt to change his looks. But after telling him they would take his picture dead or alive, he cooperated. He was eventually brought back to Durand, Wisconsin, to face trial for the murder of the Coleman brothers, where he finally dropped the facade that he was not Ed Maxwell. Ed had always loved the spotlight, and he even did an interview with a newspaper. He could be very charming when he wanted to be, but one wonders if he had any idea of the bubbling rage the polite people of Durand were feeling after he so callously murdered 2 of their own. On the afternoon of November 19th, 1881, Ed Maxwell was brought in ball and chains to the 2nd floor of this courthouse that still stands to this day. He appeared before Justice W.B. Dyer and pleaded not guilty to the charges against him. He was escorted down these stairs by 6 officers. But just as the group reached the bottom of the stairs, a wave of people appeared and pushed them down the hall, separating them from Maxwell. Approximately 25 men then surrounded Ed Maxwell and began dragging him toward the front door. Maxwell understood what was happening and, despite being in ball and chains, fought desperately to free himself. A rope with a hangman's noose was quickly thrown over his head and he was dragged out the door. The rope was then quickly thrown over the branch of a tree in front of the courthouse, and within a few moments, Ed Maxwell was dead. Once it was accomplished, the crowd quietly dispersed. It was only after this that the officers being held in the courthouse were allowed out of the building, and they quickly cut Maxwell down. Well, we've come to the end of this story. So, what happened to Alonzo Maxwell? Well, there were many rumors and stories about him for a while, but nothing was ever verified. When he slipped away into the brush near that Nebraska farmhouse, he was never heard from again. Well, that's it for another episode of I Did Not Know That. We'd really appreciate it if you like this video and subscribe to this channel. Thanks a lot.